Welcome back to It's Storytelling Time with Grumple Billy and friends. I hope you have been enjoying all the stories from my friends around South Africa. So gather around, settle down, and let's enjoy today's story together.
Thank you, Grumple Billy. Friends, let us all say thank you, Grumple Billy. Come on, come on. Thank you, Grumple Billy. Welcome, welcome, welcome to its storytelling time. I am Maria De Koker. Now, today's story is called The Little Match Girl. There was once upon a time a little girl who had no shoes to wear, not even in the winter time. This little girl was perhaps 8 years old and she lived in the very poorest part of a big town. If she had a proper name of her own, no one knew it. She was known everywhere as the Little Match Girl because each day she went out into the streets to sell bundles of matches. In the summer, the little match girl did not mind that she had no shoes. The sun warmed her bare feet as she went among the shoppers, talked to some of the friends she had made. There was the pretty young flower girl who sold tiny bunches of violets to the passing gentleman, and the street bird seller with his birds in a large cage, and the watercress girl who always greeted her with a friendly smile. But in the winter, the flower girl and the watercress girl were no longer to be found. And the little match girl was sure that she did not have a friend in the world. Once she did have someone very close to her who had loved her, her grandmother. But the old lady had died, and the match girl had only the memory of her grandmother's love to comfort her. One year, the snow came much earlier than usual, and by Christmas, the pavements were slippery with ice, and the cruel wind had whipped the snow into deep drifts against the wall and the shop fronts. The rich men of the town wore their warmest coats and mufflers and their tall hats to protect them against the biting wind. They were so anxious to be back in their cozy houses that they paid no attention to the little match girl, and they certainly did not think of buying any matches from her. It is true it was a jolly time of year, but their minds were full of thoughts about the presents they must find for their families and all the food they would presently be enjoying. So the little girl sold very few of her bundles of matches over Christmas. And on New Year's Eve, her father sent her out again. He was a hard, cruel man with no thought for his child. Even her mother did not pretend to love the little girl or seem to care that she wore only a thin cotton blouse and patched skirt. Their attic, its cracks stuffed with straw, was such a miserable place to live that the woman had long ago given up trying to be cheerful or to make those about her happy. She thought only of the money the little girl would give her at the end of the day. You can put my old slippers on your feet, the mother told her daughter as she gave her the matches. And mind you, do better than you did yesterday. Shivering with cold, the little match girl crept out into the streets. But the slippers were much too big for her small feet, and soon one had fallen off, and the ragged boy snatched it and ran away with it. Then the other slipper came off and was lost in the snow, and the little girl wandered through the streets, her toes blue with cold. How she envied the well-dressed ladies of the town with their fur bonnets and fur muffs. How she wished that some of these rich ladies would notice her and out of the kindness of their hearts offer to buy some of her matches. She waited by the coach and thought sadly that even the old horse had a better coat than she had. Some of the men carried packages under their arms, for it was still the season of goodwill and present giving. The little match girl had never had a present in her life except a tiny bunch of spring flowers from the flower girl, and that was long ago. And as she stood there, hoping she would be noticed, she began to wonder what might be in some of the parcels. Perhaps the gentleman in the blue coat was taking a doll home to his granddaughter or a cuddly bear. She thought she could guess what was in the bottle the big tall man with the red nose was carrying, and as he passed her, she called out hopefully, "Buy some matches, sir. Please take some." But the big tall man did not even turn his head to look her way, and the little girl sighed, wondering whether her father would beat her if she did not make any money that day. The snow was falling now so thickly that her hair and face were powdered with it, and she was so cold that she could not stop shivering. Yet she dared not go home. If she did, there would be no one to give her a kind word, and more than likely, her father would turn her out again. And when she thought of home, she remembered only the wind whistling through the gaps in the roof and the bare wooden floor and the straw bed upon which she had to lie. "No, I will not go home," the little girl told herself bravely. "Surely some kind lady or gentleman will buy some of my matches before the day is out." And she began walking up and down the long street and sometimes approaching one or two of the jollier looking ladies with the shy request that they take home some of her matches. Sadly, although the ladies and their husbands had only moments before being busy wishing each other happiness for the new year, they did not think of the girl's happiness or what it would mean to her if they gave her a little money. When she spoke to them, they looked the other way or buried their faces deep in their high collars or mufflers and hurried on. Now the little girl was so numb with cold that she felt weak and dizzy, and she wandered into the middle of the road and was nearly run down by a horse and carriage. The coachman cracked his whip angrily and shouted, "Why can't you look where you are going, you stupid little girl?" And the little match girl was so frightened and startled that she lost some of her precious matches in the snow. As night approached, the blizzard increased in violence, and even the fittest and strongest of the passers-by found it almost impossible to face the biting wind. They huddled inside their heavy overcoats and kept a tight grasp on their umbrellas to stop them from being tugged out of their hands by the cruel blizzard. "I cannot stay here," the little girl told herself desperately. "I must leave the busy streets and find shelter." And she dragged her numbed feet away from the crowded pavements and stumbled on towards the quiet part of the big town where the rich people lived. No one spared her a glance as she wandered away until presently she came to a road which was lined with tall, elegant houses. All the houses had lights streaming from their windows, and the little Madge girl heard the sound of laughter and tinkling of glass against glass as the people inside toasted each other. She looked around until she saw a small opening between two of the tall houses, which would give her some shelter from the wind, and she went to it and sat down on the steps. As she crouched there, she could see into one of the windows of the house opposite. How merry the ladies and their friends looked. How they laughed and shouted as they raised their glasses to each other. And then there came to her the smell of roast goose. It was such a wonderful smell that the little girl closed her eyes in an effort to capture it. She almost forgot how hungry she was as she pictured fat goose roasted to a turn sitting on the table. There was no thought now in her mind of going home. It was so late that the lamps were all lit in the dark streets, and she had little hope of selling any of her matches. To go home at this hour without any money would bring down the anger of both her mother and father on her head. And she did not face that. If only her beloved grandmother had been alive, she would have protected her from all her parents' anger. She would have drawn her within the shelter of her shawl and cuddled and kissed her and perhaps given her some tiny present which she had managed to make. The little girl sighed deeply as she pulled the ragged shawl over her head. She would have to stay where she was for the rest of the night. In the morning, it would be the first day of the new year, and perhaps then people would want to buy her matches. But now her hands were so numb with cold that they had no feeling in them. Or she thought to herself that if only she could draw out one of her matches and rub it against the wall, its flame would warm her fingers. It was not easy to do this, for her poor fingers were as stiff as boards. But at last she succeeded, and she struck the match against the wall. For an instant it sputtered and seemed to be going out. Then it began to burn with a warm, bright flame. Why, it is like a Christmas candle, the little girl thought, and it seemed to her that she was seated in a cozy armchair in front of a warm stove. The room was small, but there were heavy curtains on the windows to shut out the cold night air, and there was a pair of woolen slippers just her size by the stove. But the little girl did not think that she had any need of the slippers so long as the stove was there. It was such a great big stove, all shiny with polish, and it seemed to nod and wink at her as it warmed her feet and her hands and then her cold, wet face. "Oh, how lovely you are!" the little girl whispered. "How nice of you to warm me. I have never felt so cozy." And she cupped her hand around the bright little flame of her match as she stared at the magnificent stove. Alas, the match burnt for just a second longer and then it went out. The big friendly stove vanished, and the little girl found she had only the spent match to look at. "I must not. I dare not use any more of the matches," she told herself as she put the burnt out match on the step beside her. But I will not throw this poor match away, for it brought me a lovely dream. Some hours passed, and the little girl began to wonder if she dared strike just one more match. She was so cold and weak that she knew she would not be able to stand up to do this. But then there was no need. There was no one to see her wasting her matches, for the gay party in the house on the other side of the street was over. Or perhaps the people had simply drawn the candles before, or perhaps the people had simply drawn the curtains before sitting down to their roast goose. Fingers that were blue with cold, the little girl struck another match. It burnt up brightly, and its light fell upon the wall. Oh, oh, how bright you are! The little girl exclaimed, her eyes fixed upon it. And then the wall had vanished, and she found she could see into a room. And there, on the table, which was laid with snow white cloth, with a wonderful fat roasted goose. It sat on a great silver dish, and around it were roast potatoes. There was stuffing and two kinds of sauce, and there were dried sugar plums and all manner of delicious sweetmeats on the table besides the bird. Then, wonder of wonders, the goose hopped off its silver dish and with a knife and fork in its beak, waddled over to the little girl and invited her to take one of its wings. That's very kind of you, the little girl began to say. Yes, please, I would like that if you don't mind. When all at once the match spluttered and went out, and the goose vanished. Tears came into the little girl's eyes as she stared at the cold black wall. It had been such a wonderful sight, that snow white table laden with so many good things to eat. She knew now that it was not only the bitter weather which was making her feel so weak and helpless. It was also the fact that she had eaten nothing all day long, and without stopping to think, she lit a third match. Once again, she found herself looking into a room. It was surely the finest room in the whole world, and there, in one corner, stood the finest tree in the whole world. It was 1,000 times more beautiful than any that she had ever seen before. Balls of different colors hung from its branches, and there were candles and shimmering tinsel which sparkled in the light. And from some of the lower branches there hung boxes tied up with pretty silver ribbon. It seemed as though the tree itself was alive. As she stared at the wonderful tree, a little girl came into the room, and she looked just like the match girl, except that she was richly dressed in a cape and hood trimmed with fur. The match girl stretched out the hand to touch the beautiful young stranger, and suddenly the match went out, and the child and the Christmas tree were no longer to be seen. As soon as her cold, stiff fingers would permit, the girl lit another match against the wall, and as the flame grew brighter, she gave a cry of joy. There, standing before her, was her own dear grandmother. She was so clear and so close that the little girl reached out to touch her, and the old woman held out her arms and smiled. Take me with you. Please take me, the little girl pleaded. I've missed you so much, and I want to be with you. Her grandmother's wise, gentle face was so kind and inviting that the little girl could not take her eyes away from it. And when her match was really ready to burn itself out, she began with frantic haste to strike another. Each time her match had burnt away, she had lost some precious. Now, at all costs, she must keep her grandmother beside her. Now, the old woman was bending over her and gathering her up in her arms. And the little match girl sighed with a deep joy and thankfulness, and she felt the warmth and comfort of her grandmother's arms about her. And as her grandmother bore her up to heaven, the girl knew that all her days of hunger and want were over forever. Early the next morning, on the first day of the new year, one of the gentlemen from the tall house opposite saw the little girl lying in the snow, and he crossed the street to look at her. Poor child, he murmured to himself. She has frozen to death. How sad for her. Then he saw all the burnt matches in the snow, and he thought to himself that she had lit them to warm her poor, stiff fingers. But there was something about the little girl which puzzled the old man. It was something about her face. It looked so smiling and peaceful. It was almost as if she had seen an angel, said the old gentleman that night, as he sat cozily sipping wine with his wife by the fire. I tell you, the child looked quite happy as she lay in the snow. Oh, don't bother your head about her any longer, said his good wife sharply. It is the beginning of the year, and there are many great things to see to. And when her husband continued to stare dreamily into the flames and shake his old head, she clattered the fire tongs noisily. There now, she went on, annoyed that her husband was not paying her the attention she thought she deserved. Who cares about a little match girl? The town is full of them, and if I had my way, I'd see to it that they were all kept at home in such terrible wintry weather. It may be, said her husband mildly, that the child had nowhere to go. What on earth could have brought that smile to her face? It was such a happy one. And the old gentleman would continue to wonder, for how could he possibly guess that the little match girl had been smiling at someone as beautiful as her grandmother? Oh, thank you, friends. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.
Thank you, my friend, for that wonderful story. That's it for today, Munchkins. Join us next time for another story right here on It's Storytelling Time with Grumple Billy and friends. Don't forget to social distance, wash your hands, and always wear your mask. And be safe. Until next time.